Master the business of speaking with your hosts, Taylor and Austin. You're listening to Technically Speaking.
Welcome to another episode of Technically Speaking. We're your hosts, Taylor and Austin, and in today's episode, we're talking about how to write a book without you actually writing that book. Now, we've had previous conversations on the show about ghostwriting and how to hire somebody to write your book for you and what the pros and cons are. And to be honest, I was expecting this episode to shape up kind of similarly to some of those other episodes we've ran, but it took me entirely by surprise. And you'll find out why shortly. Now, we've invited on Emily Crookston, aka the Pocket Ph.D., who found herself as an expert in ghostwriting throughout her years of building her business. And what's very interesting about Emily's perspective is she comes from a world of writing. She is a PhD in philosophy, and she shares her story about academia and how she segued out of that and why. I think it's a very important segue. And not only that, she shares with us her process of ghostwriting and how much of a system it actually really is. Up until this point, Austin and I kind of had the perspective that ghostwriting was purely a creative process. And while there are elements of creativity there, it's very much a process and a system that can be followed. And so Emily shares down her ghostwriting process, what you can expect as an individual looking to get a book written by somebody else, shares with us some of the misconceptions and some of the pros and cons of ghostwriting. Super powerful episode, definitely not what I was expecting, and we both learned a ton. So as always, stick around until the end for some awesome resources, and we hope you enjoy this one. See you in there. Okay, we made it live. Woo, man, another show. I like how we're always surprised after we start an episode. You know what I mean, Austin? Like we're just excited, even though we've done this about 100 times now. So
yeah, you just never know. You never know.
So, technology, yeah. It's just every time we make it here. Emily, it is amazing to have you here. Welcome to Technically Speaking. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Taylor and Austin. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, for sure. For those of you that are just listening to audio too, you're currently missing out on the coolest cow painting you've ever seen in your life.
So check out the
video.
Check
out the YouTube channel.
That's exactly right. Links in the show notes. Why are you listening to the audio version anyway? The video one's so much more fun. So get over
come on,
there.
people.
All right. So Emily, we like to do a little bit of digging, a little bit of research, of course, before every show. We tend to go into investigation mode, if you will. And this wasn't too hard to dig up. But overall, we love your website, love your brand. I'm sure everyone listening, definitely go check it out. It's super cool. And you'll see why we like it, I'm sure, the second you land on the website. But one of your maybe core values, let's say, maybe that's not the right language, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but is badass is not synonymous with asshole.
Yes.
Big fan. And yes, to everyone listening, we've got the explicit label, bug off. So tell us about that, Emily.
Yes, that's awesome. That's kind of part of my manifesto or my list of values. Badass is not synonymous with asshole. Yeah, because I think, you can be yourself. You can be, if you're a little edgy, you can be edgy. But you can do that in a way that doesn't have to piss people off, be in everybody's face all the time. I'm always telling my clients, you got to have an angle or an opinion on a topic. If I'm writing a blog post for you, I'm not, I can go and do a little research and write a really generic post for you if you want. But that's not going to get your audience excited. You got to figure out what it is that makes you a badass, really. And that can be your lens through which you view everything you write and all the content you create. And so from that, perspective, you are a badass, and, you don't have to be super controversial. You don't have to really, go there if you don't want to, but you got to have a little edge. You got to have something that sets you apart from everybody else in your industry.
Yeah, man, isn't that the truth? Authenticity is so important. And it's so weird to me that there's this facade that I think everybody to some extent feels pressure to sort of conform to be able to get along in the marketplace and so on. And while I totally agree, there's boundaries somewhere. We don't want to ever make people uncomfortable. But if you really do want to stand out, to your point, the best way to do that is just to let your personality shine through. And I mean, this is so true. We've talked about this on the show before. I'm going to mention it again because I don't think that we can reinforce this point enough. But like in a world where all of the information that we could ever want is readily accessible for somebody that wants to just go find it, ultimately, like the thing that makes us unique and viable as a thought leader is us. It's our personality. Like if you're a leadership expert, this is the one that is easy to point to, but there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that call themselves leadership experts that can teach the exact same material as you, really. Right. But people will buy you because you're you. And so you have to be willing to let that shine through, you know? And to your point, I mean, how you do that is, I think, less important even than just being authentic. So I love that you live that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And I think, especially with writing, we all can kind of put on our writer hat and go back to like freshman English and be like, ooh, what are the rules? I need to be following all the rules, and I just, I love the quote, know all the rules so you can break them, or whatever it is. And that's what makes your writing stand out. That's what makes it unique. If you sound like every other person in your industry, using all the same jargon, it's just it's a blur. No one's going to even pick up on that anymore. So yeah, you got to figure out how to make yourself stand out in those ways. Yeah.
Differentiation.
Differentiation is the name of the game. 100%. All right. So like, we got to talk about your background a little bit. And so like, we take some show notes as we go to sort of help us along. And most of the time we're using it as prompts, but your website, I mean, this speaks to you as a writer, but it's so quotable. Like there's so many things on your website. So I want to reference a specific line that I saw that I think will probably help us segue into like how you've become who you've become. But you say that you're a former philosophy professor who fled academia when I realized that Ivory Tower World is built on a foundation of utter bullshit. I love it. So like, help us understand, like it's such a leap between worlds from the outside. I probably felt more organic to you, but how did this happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love to talk about this. So I was a philosophy professor. I taught philosophy for about 8 years. And the goal of becoming a philosophy professor in my mind was to get to that upper level of academia, to get tenure. That's kind of the goal. And once you have tenure, you don't have to worry about ever being fired, or in my head, that was the plan. That was like, think about job security. That's the most secure job you're ever going to find. And that's what I wanted. And it's so funny because my dad owned a small business my whole life growing up. And I think that in some sense, I have a little trauma from that experience. I'm the oldest child. I remember very well the start of the business, the arguments with his brother who owned the business with him eventually buying out my uncle. I remember all that chaos. And I think I kind of subconsciously said, I don't want anything to do with any of that. I want the most secure position I can find. And so, I got into it and I started to realize, after I'd been on the job market for 8 years, I'm not getting that tenure track position that I'm aiming for. And at a certain point, you just get so tired of the politics. And I mean, everyone talks about how toxic the corporate environment can be. It's got nothing on the toxicity in academia. I'm sorry. It's just there, and people aren't making loads of money, they're arguing over $500 and how to use that, and it's just like, so much time wasted and so much inefficiency. So all of that kind of came to a head at a certain point for me. And I was like, okay, I got to get out. And so I said, what am I going to do? Because I literally hadn't considered what I would do besides being a philosophy professor. So I gave myself a year and I said, what did I want to do before I wanted to be a philosophy professor? Well, I thought marketing was cool when I was like 13. And it turns out that a friend was looking for some marketing help. And she introduced me to the world of basically ghost blogging. And that's how I started out. She has a web development company. So she had clients who needed blog posts. This was back in 2015 or so. And so, blogging was kind of big, I would say bigger than it is now at that time. Everybody was looking for blogging. So I said, if I want to really make a living blogging, that's a lot of blogs to be writing. I can write longer stuff. And so I found my way to my first book ghostwriting clients. So I write business books for people, but yeah, it's all ghostwriting. And I love being behind the scenes. I think it's really fun. And because I have the PhD background, the research is really, part of my wheelhouse. I can work independently very easily. That part's easy. So yeah, in some ways the transition was easy, but I found the business world to be so generous. I was meeting people through networking, mostly in-person networking, and they were recommending me to other people. And I was like, you've never even seen a word I've written, but hey, that's cool. Like, I appreciate that. So yeah, it is a kind of a strange leap. I have friends in academia who say, how did you do it? But it wasn't like a long drawn out thought process. It was like, okay, this isn't working. I got to do something different. And the person who took me on as her intern to write the blogs, she eventually, mentioned to me, you could start a business doing this. And I thought, oh, maybe I will. Maybe that would work.
Wow.
Yeah. So yeah,
Wow.
that's where it was.
Amazing.
I mean, I had been thinking, I'll work for a marketing agency, but I really was dreading like a 9-to-5 kind of situation. So starting a business seemed like it really, really would work with my lifestyle and everything else. And yeah. And as you know, as business owners yourself, it doesn't mean you get to work, that 4-hour work week or whatever that myth is,
No.
You're working like 80
Oh,
hours a week
100-hour
most of the time, right? Or 60. I definitely work most weekends. But
I have to invent time to work during the week.
Yes, I know.
Right.
No, yeah, it's like, no, my meetings happen during the week, and then I do my work on the weekends. I do my writing.
Seriously,
that does happen for real.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
so
Very
was
relatable.
was it like well, given your background with your dad running a small business, kind of that subconscious trauma, you mentioned that earlier in the show, like, did you find a resistance to the idea of turning this into a business based on all of that? Or did it seem to just make sense at the time to do it? Like, what was the transition like for you to go from because you were still working, if I understood correctly, as an intern, let's say, for that, marketing friend of yours who was running the development agency. So now you kind of were left with a decision to, okay, well, I continue doing this in a corporate setting or the business. And, it sounded like you kind of had to overcome some predispositions to the idea of even having a business. What was that like?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so I was teaching I gave myself, a year still teaching philosophy as this intern, doing the marketing stuff. And I was kind of poking around at agency jobs and trying to figure out how I could weasel my way into finding those people and talking to them. So when she recommended that I start a business, it just kind of clicked for me, then I started doodling names, jotting names down on the napkin, that kind of thing. It's really funny because I never really was a freelancer. Like, people would call me freelancer and I would always recoil from that label.
Yeah,
I didn't like it. I liked the idea of being a business owner much more than a freelance writer. So I never went through, it wasn't really a long transition. It was just, business. Yeah. Why didn't I think about starting a business on my own? Why didn't that occur to me? Yeah.
That's awesome.
I think to a point,
action.
For sure. Yeah. You're somebody that very much is decisive. It seems like you make up your mind and you do something about it. And holy crap, there's a lot of squandered opportunity that happens because people spend a lot of time thinking and not a lot of time executing. So, I mean, obviously you're a very thoughtful person, but I mean, you also execute. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Good for you.
That is a huge advantage as a business owner. I think you've got to take action. You've got to make quick decisions and just do it. And if it's the wrong decision, you just change course. It's not like the world is going to fall apart. In the very beginning of my business, I remember being very worried that I was going to fail, and I think, again, the trauma of having failed my academic ambitions, really, I did, but I was like, I can't fail. And to me, failure meant having to go and get a regular job. And at a certain point, I just opened my eyes and I looked around and I was like, you're not the kind of person who fails. You got a PhD. That takes a lot of, work and decision and that kind of thing. And, the academic thing was kind of an anomaly. It's only 1% of people get tenure jobs or something. I mean, the statistics are pretty crazy. And if anyone had really pointed that out to me in a way that was meaningful, I probably would have said, whoa, wait a minute, what am I doing, much earlier than I did. But yeah, you've got to be your own cheerleader at the end of the day. When it
Through
comes to
that.
owning a business. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. Well, something that's kind of interesting to me too about like your specific journey here is that like you left the world that you had spent probably the majority of your adult life like trying to pursue and go and do. And when you departed from that, like at least based on how you described it, maybe I misinterpreted this, but it didn't sound like that you started like ghost blogging because it was something that you knew you were passionate about and loved. It was something that you knew that you could do and could provide value to, and probably to a degree that you knew that you liked it. But this is now scaled into something that I can tell just by the way you talk about it, you love. So
Yeah.
do you credit luck to that to some degree? Or do you think that there was some maybe intuition involved there? Yeah.
It's interesting. That's a really good question. I think I didn't know ghostwriting was a job anyone could have. I think that's the story with a lot of ghostwriters. They just kind of fall into it in one way or the other. And yeah, I didn't know I was good at blogging, but it turns out that writing for philosophy, I call it technical writing. You make you have your thesis statement, that's your argument, and then you back it up with all your facts, and then you address some objections at the end, and that's how you write a perfect philosophy paper every time. And that works just as well for a business blog or a blog. You have your angle or your opinion, you have a few bullet points, and you might address somebody who has questions about your bullet points there, or you might even start out with the objection. That's kind of a cool way to write the blog too. Like you might think blah, 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 but as it turns out, and then you go into your argument. So it's translated really nicely into that. And also my own academic writing style was criticized for not being scholarly enough, rigorous enough. I have a very conversational writing style, which you can see in my website. And I use that in blogs as well. And it turns out to be a nice tone for a blog as well. So yeah, but I think one of the advantages I have with ghostwriting is that I don't consider myself a writer. Like I've never been a writer. There's a lot of ghostwriters and authors. They're like, I've been writing since I was 5 years old. Not me. I never loved writing, but through my studies and getting a PhD, you learn how to write. You can't help it. You have to figure out how to write a dissertation, for example. So like, I think the technical stuff is there without too much attachment. And I think that's important. Like when people try to write their own books, sometimes they get really stuck because they're like too close to the material. They don't know how to pull out, and zoom out, think about what their audience needs. I'm great at that. Like, and that's easy. And I think it's because I'm writing for somebody else. It just makes it very easy to take that perspective without being like, oh, people say, how can you be a ghostwriter? You don't get credit. My name never ends up on anything that I write, hardly anything, other than my own blog. But I just think, these aren't my ideas. I couldn't have come up with this book on my own. I don't feel like, and it's not art to me. It's not like, oh, they're taking my words that I worked so hard for. It just really is very much like a skill that I have that I'm happy to share with other people.
Heck yeah. Well, it's a unique perspective. We've had some ghostwriting conversations on the show, and I like that it's kind of like, to use your words, you're detached from the actual like ideas of the thing. It's kind of like a process. I mean, you kind of spelled it out that you follow to help kind of pull people out of the weeds and get their voice out there. And it's like a system you have now, which is super cool. Yeah. We can definitely relate to that. Cool. So you mentioned this a minute or so ago, but you really emphasize on your website and what you just said about how like people are too close to it. They don't know what their audience, needs. They're, and I think they come from a good place. People who want to write books themselves or write their own content, they want to kind of speak from the heart. But that's not always in the lens of what their audience needs. And one of your like core points on your website, again, to point that out, is you kind of need to understand what your audience wants from you and then find a way to package that up and, deliver it to them. And so But that balance of finding out like how to write from the heart and
Mhm.
gives what the audience needs, like how do you find that balance?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think this is why it's helpful to talk about your book. I always tell my clients, talk about your book as much as possible, or even, not my clients, but authors who are trying to DIY their books.
Sure.
Talk about it because that's going to help you remember what your audience needs to hear. When you're writing, you're coming from your own perspective. You're really, engrossed in what you think is important. And sometimes it can be very hard
Mm,
to remember, oh, right, I'm not writing this for me. I'm writing it for them. But of course, to your point, you want to make sure that you're keeping the heart in there, you're keeping that authenticity and all that we've been talking about as well. And yeah, it is a tough balance sometimes. I think the biggest piece of advice I can give around that is, maybe write one version of the chapter with your own heart and your own thoughts in mind, whatever you want, and then go and talk to people, and then write a second version that has more of those points pulled in from your audience, and then you can kind of marry the two in a way. Sometimes that can work, and it's kind of a like shuffling
yeah.
cards. You're trying to find that balance, that can work. But also, I think,
Wow, that
I
makes
know
sense.
a lot of your listeners are speakers. And so,
Yeah.
you can absolutely sometimes do a better job of conveying all of that stuff in a talk rather than in writing. So if you start with the talk and then turn that into your article or your book, that can also be a really good way to make sure that, the passion and the heart stays in there, because we tend to talk more from that than when we sit down and write.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I really like that differentiation. I haven't had it broken down like that, but like when you are writing, you're really like you're like as close to it as you can possibly get because you're
Mhm.
funneling your perspectives into something. Whereas if you're like having a conversation about it, you're almost a little bit more removed from it, because you're listening, you're in active conversation about it. So I feel
Yeah.
like you just shifted a paradigm for me here.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I think I hear speaking coaches say to people, pretend you're talking to one person rather than an audience, and the same applies for
Sure.
writing for sure. Pretend you're writing to one person in your audience. That's always a really solid way to think of it.
Man, already you're dropping practical bombs on us. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Awesome. Yeah.
So something that I want to get your perspective on.
Mhm.
There's this. I don't know if it's actually like a named theory or not, but there's a phrase that gets used, the curse of knowledge,
Mm.
where because we're so close to it, we take for granted the information we have and then do a poor
Mhm.
job at communicating that to our audience because we assume that they know foundational stuff that maybe they don't. And
Mhm.
so we only halfway get the message across because of these assumptions that we're making.
Yep.
I can imagine that one of the benefits to working with somebody like you would be that you need to more or less understand what's trying to be communicated, and as somebody that doesn't have their expertise, you're a filter now
Yeah.
that you can take complex ideas that they would communicate without thinking or hard to understand, and now you can say, oh well, hold on, like help me understand what this actually means, and now we're communicating a better version of the idea that can connect better with somebody that might not have that knowledge.
Mhm.
Is that a correct assumption? Is
Yep.
that something you look for and try to do while you're working with people?
Yeah, 100%. The less I know about your topic, the better in a lot of cases, because then I'm coming at
Interesting.
really from your reader's
Yeah.
perspective. I do this a lot when I'm editing. I do developmental editing as well. I say I'm your first reader, because I don't know anything about this topic, or much less than you do anyway. So anything that's not clear to me is not going to be clear to your audience. And let's figure out how to make that bridge that gap. I often think of myself as a translator. You've got this expertise.
Yeah.
A lot of my clients, they have very nuanced work that they're doing. I have a corporate communications client, but she doesn't label herself as corporate communications. She talks about herself as communication strategist, but she's not PR. She's not marketing. She does crisis communications. So explaining, the work that she does can be a huge challenge from a marketing perspective. She can get in there with her clients and be amazing in the room, but in writing, it's a lot harder. And I think we do add a lot of value. My team and I add a lot of value by just being able to say, explain this jargony term to us. And we're, what is the practical takeaway from this? What's the one thing you say to your clients that makes them sign the contract? Like what is the thing that's really driving your audience? Yeah.
Wow, that's
man,
awesome.
Brilliant. Yep.
Yeah, I like there's a process there. Speaking of, so this is just my own curiosity here. I'm sure people who haven't been familiar with working with a ghostwriter probably are thinking this too. Again, ignorance is bliss here on my end. So, I'm really curious about like the process of ghostwriting. So let's take a book, for example, right? Like, what's the journey you take somebody through to get a book completed? Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, definitely. So you come to me with an outline of your book idea. That could be very high level. That could just be sort of chapter topics, or a list of ideas that you really want to talk about in some kind of order that makes some sense to you. Some order is always a little bit helpful. And then we meet, and it's a 16-week process that we go through. We meet once a week throughout that process. I like to get to a full draft in 8 weeks if we can. And then we have 8 weeks to edit. And that's how we work. We work really collaboratively. We meet and talk through different pieces of the book. I go away and do the writing for 10 or 20 hours a week, and then you do the editing or you do the revisions, and I can do that as well. So it ends up, when it works really well, it's a mind meld. It's your expertise combined with my writing and my time, because you don't have the time to hack the whole thing out, and you don't have the bandwidth to even think about getting that whole idea down on the page. You let me do that part, and you just come with the inspiring ideas and the expertise. So, I tell people it could take like an hour of your time every week, and then toward the end, it might take a little more of your time. But, basically you're getting an entire book written with about 20 hours of your time being given to us. And when we do ghostwriting for smaller projects like LinkedIn posts and blog posts, we meet with somebody for 30 minutes during the month, and we create all their content based on that 30-minute conversation. So we really try. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the main value add for working with a ghostwriter. I've met ghostwriters who say, oh yeah, I'll write your book. I'm not going to give, there's not a deadline. Maybe I can get it done in a year, like this kind of stuff. And I think, why would you pay for that service? Like, you can write your own book in a year, probably working 2 hours on the weekend, if you're disciplined.
Sure.
So I feel like the value is, look, you're going to get a book done in 16 weeks, or, you're going to get your social media content done 30 minutes a month, because nobody's got time for creating all this content that we're creating, that we need
for sure
to keep our businesses going.
That's the aspiration, but not reality usually.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
So
yeah,
yeah.
this is so valuable. Okay, a couple of things. First of all, I cannot help but tangent a little bit, because you used the phrase mind meld a moment ago. And then, if I'm not mistaken, there's a symbol of the Jedi Rebel Alliance on your site referencing Rebel. So are you actually like a Star Wars, Star Trek fan? Is this reality?
I am not the biggest fan, but I think that the analogy works really well for what I'm trying to do with my clients. So yeah, I've seen all of it. I've seen the Star Wars, but that's not my.
Yeah,
I'm not a Trekkie or anything like that. Yeah, but it's cool. Yeah,
fair enough. There's a geekery spectrum, right? So I'm just trying to figure out where you're at on the spectrum.
You're on the continuum. That's right.
Yep. Definitely, like, the way you think is fascinating to me to some extent, because when you think of somebody who's a writer, and I know you said that you don't really think of yourself that way, so I'm starting to like really understand why that's your sort of frame of reference here. But writing, I think, for most people is seen as this highly creative endeavor, and so you find people that are the creative types more so than like a structured systems type. But you really are living in both worlds at any point. You just explained to us a very structured process with tight deadlines, and these things are, I would say, probably atypical for a lot of the creative minded people that I see, while simultaneously obviously being very skilled in the creative side of things as well. So does one of those come more naturally to you than another?
That's a good question. I really like borrowing ideas from people. I like that they come to me with the ideas. And, if I have a client who's relying on me for generating ideas, that project is not going to go very well because I'm not that comfortable in your industry coming up with these ideas for you, so I really need a lot in the idea spectrum, in the creative side of things, from the other person. And then, I think I tend to be creative within a box, like you give me the I don't know, the groundwork, or you give me the foundational pieces and I'll take them and I'll tell you, here's where they go. Like this, I think, is why I really love developmental editing. It's really high level. It's not proofreading at all. It's let's get into the sausage and figure out what your best idea is here. And let's highlight that. I worked with somebody to write a book, or to edit her book rather. And, she had all these chapters. They were beautifully, she had lots of great storytelling, but there was a story in chapter 9. And I was like, this should be in the introduction. This should be the first chapter. This needs to be up front because this is the most interesting story of this book, and so I'm pretty good at pulling out that kind of stuff and seeing that, like, creative within a box. And maybe that's why the ghostwriting works so well for me, because that's what you want from a good ghostwriter. You want somebody who can take your ideas and jigger them around and spit them back out as if you had written them on your best day. I really like that aspect of the whole process. I like that I have to learn enough about a subject to be able to write an entire book about it in 16 weeks and then send you on your way to promote your book and sell it. It's a perfect process for me. I think it's a service that I can provide, just tailor-made almost for my skills.
Yeah, for sure. Well, heck yeah. I just like the way you think about this. It's unique to the previous conversations we've had about ghostwriting. It's been more of that. I don't want to discredit your creativity by any means, creativity within a box, but, we kind of get a blend of the goat writers, highly creative, highly visionary people. It's a roller coaster to get through the thing basically, but it's very procedural, you've got a process down that allows you to deliver something in that amount of time. And I mean, it's just, I was not expecting this conversation today, is basically my point. I think it's super awesome.
In the best way.
In the best way possible.
Cool.
I just love the perspective shift.
I mean, it's so important. I think a lot of people who are ghostwriters are authors. They write their own books, and they're doing the ghostwriting to supplement their income until they get their bestseller, until they hit it big or whatever. But I think that kind of perspective, first of all, it really does make you feel like you're giving away your words. You could be spending that time writing your own book and you're giving away your time to write someone else's book and you're not getting any credit for it. But also writers and authors are really creative and they have their own ideas. And it's probably hard for them not to impose those ideas on their client's work. And I think me being more of a blank slate around that stuff is very, very helpful. And, with clients I've worked with long term, like I have a blogging client I've had since the very beginning of my business, like 6 or 7 years. I do come up with topic ideas for her a lot, and I do, use those past ideas to sort of shape the new content that we're creating. But at the end of the day, it's still in her voice. When I'm writing, I even often hear my client's voice in my head when I'm writing. And I think,
no kidding.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's almost like method acting or something. You're like putting on someone's persona on stage, but in front of the computer to get the words written.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, that illustrates that sort of mind meld thing that you were just talking about there, which makes sense, right? Like to the very first point that we made in this conversation about authenticity, like you have almost like, and maybe this is putting it too seriously, but like kind of a sacred responsibility to preserve the way that somebody communicates their ideas and their style, because it needs to read authentically to somebody, right? Mm-hmm. And so you do sort of need to hear their voice so that you would be communicating the way that they would be communicating, which is an important job.
Right. And I have a really thick skin as a philosopher, so it doesn't hurt my feelings when you say, oh, I don't like the way this reads. I'm like, okay, cool, let's fix it.
Right.
I'm always telling my clients, this doesn't sound, if you would never say this, tell me you would never say it like this so that we can, fix it and figure out what you would say. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I dig that.
Cool.
Okay. So I can't believe we're almost at the half-hour mark here. I have one sort of final thing that I want to reference, both about probably your process and the way that you think about things, but also the types of people that might work with you. Because there's a lot of people that are, I'm sure, listening to this episode and really resonating with like the thought process behind everything that you've just described here. But something that you point out are people that you really enjoy working with. And I think mavericks, people that are a little rebellious. Yeah. There's this sort of like, rebellious energy about your whole brand, and it sounds like who you like to work with as well. So, like, where does that come from? And can you help me define like really what that means for you?
Sure. Yeah, rebels, renegades, and mavericks. That's kind of my tagline.
Yes, that's the one.
I'm fiercely independent. I was raised to be fiercely independent. That has its good and bad sides, obviously. But when I'm working with somebody, I come across people and, they it's like everybody in this industry offers strategic planning, for example, right? Like you meet somebody and they're just doing the thing that everybody else in their industry does. And it's just really hard to find something interesting to say when that's your perspective or that's where you're coming from. And of course, differentiation, you even if you do strategic planning, that's cool. But how do you talk about strategic planning? And do you talk about it in a way that other people do not and set you apart from everybody else in your industry? I was in a boot camp this week, and one of the things she said was, you don't want to be generally useful, right? You want to be useful in a really specific way, in a way that you stand out from the crowd, And I just love trying to help people figure out what that looks like for themselves. If you can come with some ideas about it, even better. We're going to get an even better result that way. But yeah, I mean, and I love people who are ready to disrupt their industries, and we're writing about something that's like really cutting edge and no one else they haven't talked about it yet. It's brand new. They're trying to, corner a market or something like that, be a market leader in some way. That's fun because that's a challenge. We're trying to figure out how to say this in a way that makes sense, in a way that it connects up to what people understand, because if you're totally disconnected from your industry, you're also going to be in trouble because people are going to be like, I don't know what that is, especially in this day and age when, our attention spans are so short. You've got to find a way to like get in and say what it is and give someone that aha, or that like, oh, that's different from what I'm hearing from everybody else, in a good way. Right. I just love that challenge. And that's, almost more of a content marketing challenge than a book challenge. But the book stuff definitely applies as well. And working with, people who truly are thought leaders, not just calling themselves thought leaders, right? But people who actually have something new and interesting to say, that really just gets me going. Like,
yeah. Man, that's a powerful thing. I love everything that you've just described. It's actually one of the reasons that Taylor and I really fell in love with working with speakers, coaches, authors, consultants, podcasters, because they tend to fit that bill. There's something about, you kind of have to be not like against the grain entirely, but you have to have a point that you're making, and probably a point that other people aren't making. And it's really what makes it interesting. Like, that's the coolest part about having unique ideas and being people and being able to share them,
Yes.
So
that's
I just love your whole thought process.
Yeah. I mean, that's what starts conversations. And I think a lot of times people shy away from that because they don't want to pull the trolls in, or, they're worried about somebody saying they're wrong about something. But, I think everybody needs to have thicker skin around that. Like, so what if you think I'm wrong? Let's talk about it. Let's figure out, where we disagree exactly, rather than, the knee jerk. If we could have more of those conversations, I think we'd be in a better place. The world, would be in a better place. Yeah.
Isn't that the truth? I 100% agree with that. Well, Emily, thank you so much for coming on. And like, your story is awesome. You're just a great human being. And I mean, you've shared a lot today and helped me understand ghostwriting in a wholly different lens. So that's amazing. Thank you for creating so much value for us. Tell us, like, what else are you working on that our listeners might be able to take advantage of?
Yeah, thanks, Austin and Taylor. I appreciate you having me on. And so the newest thing I'm doing are LinkedIn hot seats. And if you're interested, you can hop on my newsletter list, my email newsletter, and I'll keep you posted about those LinkedIn hot seats. But you just basically come, and if you're brave and you want to share your LinkedIn profile with me, then I'll take a look and tell you what I see, basically. And then I have the LinkedIn roadmap. If you're curious about LinkedIn services, we do those services. We create posts for people. We help you with your strategy, and we do that with or without blogging. I find that combining all of your content marketing into one place, it can really build and grow your audience and help you really get the word out in a really comprehensive way. And so those services are all available on my website. The company is the Pocket Ph.D. And yeah, come connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to meet everybody.
Oh man, that is so great. Everybody, please go take advantage of that. As always, the links to everything will be in the show notes, so go check it out. Emily, thank you again for coming on. And everybody, if you like this episode, don't forget to rate it, like it, subscribe to it. And if you want more awesome resources like this, go to speakerflow.com/resources.
Thanks for tuning in today. Check the show notes for more info and see you next time. Later.